Welcome to another Truth Outreach program, a program that's grounded in truth, bringing you a comparison of the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, and comparing that teaching, those teachings and doctrines, to God's holy word, the Bible, which is where we get Christianity. So we compare Mormonism to Christianity. We use God's inerrant word, the good old B-I-B-L-E, basic instruction before leaving Earth. I'm Rocky Hulse, and this lovely lady on my right is my beautiful wife, Helen.
Well, we just welcome you to another program, and I'm so thankful that you're tuning in, as Rocky is, and viewing us, whether you're in your home or hotel room or just wherever you happen to be watching the show. Welcome, and we are just thank you so much for your prayers. There are many of you out there that watch this program on a regular basis, and I know that you're praying for Rocky and I and lifting us up before God's throne, and we so appreciate that fact. We really do.
Well, Helen and I are the directors of the Nauvoo Christian Visitors Center in Nauvoo, Illinois, and this show, Truth Outreach, the name of this program, is a part of that ministry. And weekly we come to you and bring you a comparison of a doctrine or a teaching of Mormonism, compare it to Christianity, and show that Mormonism is in fact not Christian. We're not being mean when we say that. We are doing a comparison. We are not making these things up. We bring forth the documentation. We bring forth everything to show that there is a difference, and a very obvious difference between Mormonism and Christianity. We like to start our programs with quotes from Mormon leaders, which we believe validates what we do. Today's quote is from George A. Smith, second counselor to Brigham Young, and he said, "If a faith will not bear to be investigated, if its preachers and professors are afraid to have it examined, their foundation must be very weak." So what we're going to be doing is examining the foundations. Again, this week, as we do every week on this program, just as George A. Smith, second counselor to Brigham Young, invited us to do. Well, today's program is titled, "The False Prophecy of the Civil War." Now, this prophecy of Joseph Smith's is touted by Mormons as proof that Joseph Smith was a modern-day prophet. And the proof shows absolutely otherwise, okay? But before we get into that, let's put up for you how to get in touch with this ministry. I'm going to put up for you on the screen how to get in touch with us and our address and our website, so that you can use us as a resource for information about Mormonism. We're the Nauvoo, Helen and I are the directors at the Nauvoo Christian Visitors Center, Post Office Box 93, Nauvoo, Illinois. The zip code is 62354. If you're mailing from outside of the United States, you need to put USA on the envelope. Our phone number is up there, 217-453-2372, and our website, www.nauvoochristian.org. And you can email us right through the website, okay? Well, let's look at this Civil War prophecy, okay? Under the date of December the 25th, 1832, Joseph Smith gave his famous revelation, and this is probably his most famous. There's hardly a Mormon that doesn't know about this revelation. So under the date December 25th, 1832, Joseph Smith gives this famous revelation concerning the Civil War here in the United States. Now, it is printed as follows in section 87 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Now, this here, it looks like a Bible, but it's called a triple combination or a 3-in-1. It's purely additional Mormon scripture. It has the Book of Mormon in it, the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a compilation of the revelations given to Joseph Smith and one or two others, but 98% of this volume in the Doctrine and Covenants or revelations given to Joseph. And then it also has the Pearl of Great Price in it, okay? So that's where this comes from. It's section 87, and I'm just going to go right through.
Make it absolutely clear, I think, though,
Okay.
that is Revelations, but those are not revelations from the God of the Bible. So if anyone out there is watching this program and you hear Rocky say those things, sometimes he so much takes it for granted that you all understand those differences and those terminology differences. But when he's talking about revelations from God that's in the Book of Mormon or in the Doctrine and Covenants, that is not from the God of the Bible. So sometimes
That's a good
you're
point.
just taking it for granted that folks understand that. But the Book of Mormon is a false book. It's a book that is based on absolutely nothing. The Doctrines and Covenants is nothing but an additional scripture that is based on false revelations and absolute made-up
Information, whatever.
Yeah, information is a good word to put, because it's not a revelation from the God of the Bible. So I just thought that was
well,
important.
and we're going to see that.
Yeah.
Because what I'm going to put up for you on this screen is from section 87 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and it's going to be this Civil War prophecy, and then I'm going to show you how it is in fact false.
Right.
Okay. So let's just start. Here's verse 1. Verily, thus saith the Lord. Okay, so he starts right out saying this is Jesus Christ talking to him. Verily, thus saith the Lord, concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which is a state up here in the United States, for those of you viewing outside the country that may not know that. I'll continue, which will eventually terminate in death and misery of many souls. Verse 2, and the time will come that war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place. Which place? South Carolina. Verse 3, for behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation Great Britain, as it is called, and they shall also call upon other nations in order to defend themselves against other nations, and then war shall be poured out upon all nations. Verse 4, and it shall come to pass, after many days, slaves shall rise up against their masters, who shall be marshaled and disciplined for war. Verse 5, and it shall come to pass also that the remnants who are left of the land, this is the American Indians, the remnants who are left of the land will marshal themselves and shall become exceedingly angry and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation. Verse 6, and thus with the sword and by bloodshed the inhabitants of the earth shall mourn, and with famine and plague and earthquake and the thunder of heaven and the fierce and livid lightning also shall the inhabitants of the earth be made to feel the wrath and indignation and chastening hand of an almighty God, until the consumption decreed hath made a full end of all nations. Verse 7, that the cry of the saints and of the blood of the saints shall cease to come up in the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth from the earth, to be avenged of their enemies. Verse 8, wherefore stand ye in holy places, and be not moved until the day of the Lord come, for behold, it cometh quickly, said the Lord. Amen. Now, this was a false prophecy. It's very clear to see, because war did not break out on all nations. Other nations did not call on other nations to defend themselves, because our civil war did not encompass all or other nations, period. No. And the remnants of the land, the Indians, American Indians, did not vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation. So Mormons simply overlook the false portions of this prophecy, and they fix themselves on the fact that Joseph Smith said that the war would start as a result of the rebellion in South Carolina. Now, they're proclaiming this as a great prophecy of Joseph Smith is based on the fact that he gave this revelation on Christmas Day, 1832. Now, Mormon statements of this prophecy's validity kind of go along this line right here. And I want to put it up for you on the screen. We hear this kind of statement very often from Mormons. They say, how could Joseph Smith have known of the Civil War and predicted it would start with the rebellion in South Carolina 28 years before the war began? Now, on the surface, that's a pretty valid question, okay? And if you don't know American history, that question is a right one to ask. But a simple review of American history answers that question. Mm-hmm. In the year 1828, now this is 4 years before Joseph Smith wrote this prophecy and recorded it in 1832. So, in the year 1828, the U.S. Congress, the United States Congress, passed what was called a Tariff Act that the South, the southern states, sorely objected to. Now, at this time, 1828, John C. Calhoun was the Vice President of the United States, and he was from the state of South Carolina. Now, I want to put up for you some information about this on the screen. Political factions in South Carolina, the so-called nullifiers and unionists, disagreed over the tariff issue. The Unionists believing in applying federal law, even the hated tariff, uniformly. The Nullifiers did not. Their position was expounded in 1828 by U.S. Vice President John C. Calhoun of South Carolina in a pamphlet that he published called South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Calhoun argued that the tariff violated the state's rights and made it a slave of northern manufacturing interests. So, history shows us that the U.S. Civil War didn't just happen in the year 1860, but there was a long, slow buildup to the succession, or I should say the secession, of the South from the Union. Mm-hmm. South Carolina was in protest of the 1828 Tariff Act, and John C. Calhoun wrote this pamphlet in 1828 expounding on the viewpoint of the South being in total opposition to this Tariff Act. On July the 14th, 1832, now Joseph Smith recorded this prophecy of the Civil War on Christmas Day, 1832. Let's back up. July 14th of 1832, the United States Congress passed another Tariff Act that the South was in opposition to. In November of 1832, the South, or South Carolina, was so opposed to this, they called a state convention. And they declared that both the 1828 Tariff Act and the 1832 tariff, they declared them to be null and void and not enforceable in South Carolina. And that if the federal government tried to enforce them, they would secede from the Union. Now, so this Tariff Act came out in July of 1832. South Carolina called a state convention in November of 1832, declared this law passed by the Congress to be null and void, and that if the United States tried to enforce it on them, that they would secede from the Union. Okay? This was in November 1832, a month prior to Joseph Smith writing this prophecy. Now, President Andrew Jackson, because of this convention in South Carolina, he put the United States Army on alert, and everyone expected war to erupt in 1832. Vice President Calhoun was so incensed over this that he resigned from the vice presidency of the United States over this whole issue on December the 28th of 1832. Now, the state convention called in November of 1832 didn't just happen. From the passage of this Tariff Act back in July, the nation's newspapers had been filled with the rumblings of the South and especially South Carolina's legislatures, culminating in their calling the state convention where they declared that these Tariff Acts of 1828 and 1832 were null and void. So for Mormons to gloat over the fact that Joseph Smith predicted the Civil War 28 years before it happened is simply to ignore United States history. A compromise bill was passed by Congress in 1833, which averted the South from seceding from the Union at that time. The issue wasn't totally settled, though, and wouldn't be, and eventually, 28 years later, the South did secede from the Union, and the United States Civil War began. Now, while I was doing the research for this program and getting all this information about these tariff acts and how the South was just incensed by them, the state convention and all that, a very, very interesting fact turned up when I started doing the research. And I want to put it up for you on the screen. Interesting fact about this revelation. On December the 10th of 1832, the Boston Daily Advisor and Patriot, that was the name of the paper, printed extracts from the message of the governor of South Carolina at the opening of the legislature, November the 27th, 1832. His message warned that South Carolina was prepared to resist the United States government by force if necessary. The same day that this was printed, on December the 10th, 1832, Orson Hyde left Boston. And on December the 22nd of 1832, he arrived at Kirtland, Ohio. Okay? So the same day that this was printed, December the 10th, 1832, Orson Hyde left Boston. And on December the 22nd, 1832, he arrived at Kirtland, Ohio, which is where Joseph Smith was. This comes right out of his journal, the Journal of Orson Hyde. And we cannot, of course, prove that Orson Hyde brought a copy of the Boston Daily Advisor and Patriot with him. But it is interesting to note that just 3 days after his arrival in Kirtland on December the 25th of 1832, Joseph Smith gave his revelation on the rebellion of South Carolina. Now, this comes out of a book called Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, page 190. Now, this prophecy, the Civil War prophecy by Joseph Smith, is contained in the history of the Mormon Church. It's called the History of the Church. However, interesting to note, when the History of the Church was first printed in the Times and Seasons, which was a newspaper printed in Nauvoo, Illinois, when the History of the Church was first printed, because it had successive printings, they were printing little bits of it every printing of the Times and Seasons. So when the History of the Church was printed in the Times and Seasons and the Millennial Star, which was the Mormon Church newspaper in Europe, this revelation was deliberately left out. So let's look at a photocopy of the Times and Seasons for November the 1st, 1844. Now, what you see right there where that blue arrow is on the right-hand side, that's a photocopy of the Times and Seasons. And in what you're looking at there is this reproductive printing of the History of the Church. That's where it was first published. Well, in today's History of the Church, where that arrow is on the right-hand side of the screen, right there is where this prophecy is printed in the current volumes of the History of the Church. But in the Times and Seasons, it's not there. That's where it should be, but it was left out. Now, also when this part of the church history, or I should say History of the Church, was written in the Millennial Star in the year 1852, 8 years after the Times and Seasons, it was also left out. Now, this prophecy, which did not appear in the history as published the first two times, is now considered to be one of Joseph Smith's most important revelations. Well, Joseph Smith gave this revelation when South Carolina rebelled against the laws of the United States in 1832, and war was expected. However, it didn't happen, and so this revelation was considered to be a failure. There's only two possible explanations why this revelation was omitted when the history was first published in the Times and Seasons in 1842 and then in the Millennial Star in 1852. One is that Joseph was ashamed of this revelation and deliberately left it out. And it was added in after his death by church historians, which means that they falsely added 309 words containing this prophecy. Or two, if Joseph did include it in the original manuscript, then it was falsely edited out. Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith, who were the church historians at the time, stated that Brigham Young approved all the revisions that were made. So this history of the church deliberately left out this revelation, which today Mormons today just tout this as absolute proof that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God because he predicted the Civil War 28 years before it happened. As we've clearly shown by documentation here today, that the United States expected the Civil War to begin in the year 1832 because South Carolina dug in its heels and said, you're not enforcing that law. They rebelled. They so stated in their state convention that if the United States attempted to enforce this tariff act, they would resist by force if necessary. So the winds of war were in place. All this information was circulating in the nation's newspapers. So all Joseph Smith did was record in a prophecy what was happening in the newspapers. And then it didn't happen. In 1833, right after this state convention by South Carolina and them saying that they were going to resist or whatever, there was a compromise bill reached in Congress, which is happens all the time. We see this even today in the legislative process. They reached compromises, and in 1833 they reached this compromise measure, and it quieted things down, and so no war. And so when they started printing the history of the church in the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo in 1844, 12 years after this revelation, there was no war. So it was deemed to be a failure. So it was just conveniently left out. In 1852, 8 years later, when they reprinted it in the Millennial Star in England, same thing. They just left it out. Now today, when you pick up the history of the church, it's there for all to see. Because war did happen, the Civil War happened in 1860. However, we read verse by verse that Civil War prophecy, and I'm sorry, but it's a false prophecy because war did not break out on all nations.
Well, he totally embellished the whole thing, is what he did.
Well, I agree with that.
He just embellished on what was common knowledge. That's exactly what he did.
And it didn't happen.
No.
And so the whole, you can't cherry pick prophecies. God doesn't need to be cherry picked. If God delivers a prophecy, God knew the end before the beginning. So God doesn't need to have someone cherry pick his prophecies about, we'll take this little portion, but we'll forget about that because it didn't happen. No, if it came from God, it all will happen just as God says. But that prophecy didn't happen. And the reason it didn't is because God didn't say it. It was simply Joseph Smith recounting and making a prophecy out of what he thought was going to happen, and it didn't happen. And so, and as Helen said, I like the way you worded that, it was an embellishment. That war would begin in South Carolina and then would go to all nations. Well, that didn't happen. It's a false prophecy. And so it very clearly shows this famous prophecy of Joseph Smith clearly shows that he was a false prophet. And this whole thing about, how could Joseph Smith have known this 28 years before the Civil War broke out? Well, we just clearly showed how he would have known that. A review of U.S. history, of United States history, clearly shows what was going on in 1828, the first Tariff Act, up to 1832, the summer of 1832, the second one, and the rebellion by South Carolina against those two acts in November in their state convention, a full month before Joseph Smith recorded this revelation. It was just what was happening at the time. It was history in the making right then. It was no revelatory thing on Joseph Smith's part, plain and simple.
That's exactly what I was saying, that he simply embellished on something that was already known and common knowledge.
And so...
And that's true of a lot of Mormonism. When you start looking at the history of Mormonism, you will find that there are things that have just been completely ripped out and torn away and pushed away and hidden, and things that have been added in to Mormonism, and that is why it is such a hideous religion, in the sense that it teaches a false Jesus, a false prophet, and a false book called the Book of Mormon.
Well, and if it was true, you know, folks, if Mormonism was true, then we all, Helen and I, everybody watching, we need, if Mormonism's true, we should know. But on the flip side of that coin, if Mormonism is not true, we should know as well. And specifically those who are involved in it. Because if Mormonism isn't true, then it is presenting a false teaching, a false religion. And the Bible specifically warns us about those things. And we teach on this program, we've shown several times, and we will again, that Mormonism brings forth a false Jesus. And if you believe in a false Jesus, then on resurrection morning, you're going to hear the saddest words recorded in all the Bible in Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." We have a burden for Mormons, for the Mormon people. That is why we do this program. That is why we have the ministry and are involved in the ministry that we are in. We have a burden for them because they're my family. And my family are still Mormons. And they are believing in this false Jesus. And so it's imperative on us, we Christians, to present to Mormons the truth. And the truth can be found right here in God's holy word, the Bible. And so that is why we do this program. And we need your help, folks, to do it. In order for us to stay on the air and to provide this teaching to the United States and to those countries outside the United States, in Central America, South America, and Europe, and hopefully expanding into Africa and Asia in the future. In order for us to bring this teaching, we need you to partner with us. Be a partner for truth. Here in about 20 seconds up on the screen will be the end of the program. There'll be information there on how to get in touch with us, how to partner with us to bring you this teaching and to bring it to Mormons, and to educate Christians, and to bring the truth of Jesus Christ to non-Christians. God bless you. We'll see you next week.